Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second week of the fall 2018 semester. So, I've noticed that everybody got their quizzes done last week and everybody got A's on them. So, I'm very pleased to see that you have now formed a foundation upon which to build as we move forward and study the British literature from about the year 1800 on forward. This week's assignment goes a little bit earlier than that. It goes back into the mid 1790s when two men by the name of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge actually released a book called Lyrical Ballads. And lyrical ballads would be the beginning of something known as the Romantic movement. Now, we're going to study one poet during the Romantic period that predates lyrical ballads, and when we get to William Blake, you'll see that. But for the most part, a whole new movement was born out of an experiment. And as you read the little portion of the preface to Lyrical Ballads that William Wordsworth wrote, you'll see that he says, hey, this book is an experiment. We're trying to see if we can write poetry that's accessible to everybody, not just the educated elite. And we're going to try to write poetry that focuses on everyday things rather than on gods and on mythical creatures and things like that. That would kick off a Romantic movement, which we'll be spending the next, I think, 4 weeks or so on. So do bear in mind that you need to have this book really in order to read the part of the preface that is required. You're not required to read the whole preface, because if you were, that's about 30-something pages. That's a lot. In this book, you'll have the portion that you need. And I'm not even making you read all of the pages in the preface that are in this book. I'm only asking you to read the two sections, What is a Poet and the Tranquility, Thoughts on Tranquility. So read those, and then read the Introduction to Course of Romanticism, read the two poems by Wordsworth that I've asked you to read, and then read Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Take that quiz. It is an open book quiz. So, for example, in the Ode is a pretty difficult poem. The other poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, is much more accessible, and in fact, it's much easier than Ode. And Taylor Coleridge's poem is also easier to follow than the Ode is. The Ode, you're going to have to read each stanza probably 4 or 5 times to get it. And that's a little bit different than what Wordsworth was saying, and yet, at the same time, it's still easier than the poets that the Lyrical Ballads was a reaction against, poets such as Alexander Pope, John Dryden. Jonathan Swift was more of a prose writer than a poet, but still, the same thing. So, the Romantic movement was a reaction against the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. And so you will find that there were more rustic settings, there were more rustic elements to the poem than there would have been had we looked at the Age of Reason. All right, so after you've taken your quiz, which again is open book so you can follow along as you take it, you must then do the written response. And there's a drop box in there for you. You're in English 21-22 now, so you should already know how to use the drop box in D2L. And I've got these instructions in there as well that you can download, or you can leave them on your screen, however you want to do it. But you got to read these instructions. You got to read them carefully, because my expectations and what I'm going to grade you on are outlined in these instructions. So this week there's a 3-parter. So every week is going to go like this. Every week you're going to have a reading. You're going to have a reading quiz to make sure you've read everything. And then you're going to have a discussion posting, or a discussion question, which you'll type up on Word and upload into the Dropbox, so that you can think more deeply about something that you've read that week. In this case, I'm going to ask you to think deeply about both Wordsworth and Coleridge. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Part 1, you're going to discuss in a paragraph or so how William Wordsworth describes what poetry is. And then you're going to describe how his poems, Ode, Intimations on Immortality, and I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, are examples of poems that Wordsworth described in the preface. So what elements that he described in the preface turn up in these two poems? And then Samuel Taylor Coleridge, even though they were collaborators in many ways, Wordsworth wrote most of the poems in Lyrical Ballads. Samuel Taylor Coleridge did not write poems quite as prolifically as William Wordsworth did. And he had a couple of differences in opinion as far as what poetry should incur. In Rime of the Ancient Mariner, there are supernatural elements that contrast wholly with Wordsworth's wanting to write about nature in ways that you could observe it, in ways that, were real. Samuel Taylor Coleridge has spirits and ghosts and things of that nature in his poem, Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So you'll, in the third paragraph, look at how they contrast. And that's it, just 3 paragraphs, a paragraph for each part. These writings that you're going to do every week, you're only going to have to do 2 to 3 paragraphs. You're not usually, this week 3 obviously, but you're not going to have to write me a book. Now, if you want to really talk about something and you turn it into 2 or 3 pages, that's great. I'll read it, I'll grade it, and I will be happy that you were motivated by what you read enough that you wanted to do more than just a couple paragraphs. But really, a couple paragraphs a week is all I'm going to be asking. So remember, this is the introduction to the Romantic movement. We're going to take a look at the 2 pioneers that more or less launched this movement in William Wordsworth and his collaborator Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and we're going to look at their poems and how they apply romantic elements to those poems. So that's it. I will look forward to seeing how you guys react to this, and I will also give you a lot of input on this first essay. The input will probably be reduced as the semester goes along, because by then you'll probably understand what I want and you'll write to it. But in the meantime, I'll give you as much input as I can on this first essay so that you do well. And I really do hope you'll enjoy the early Romantic poets.